Thank you, everyone. I'll try and keep it brief because lunch is nearly here and I know better than to get in the way of a bus operator and lunch. I've spent most of my career working in and around the growth areas, particularly in Melbourne and the regions, and so I've seen firsthand a lot of what Bronwyn and the others have been talking about in terms of the growing pains that they're experiencing at the moment. And I suppose my presentation is really about the practicalities of that and a bit of an understanding of where I see things. And someone's knocked off the zapper. I've got a proposition for you in that I think it's time that we rebalanced the growth proposition in Australia and looked at our regional centres and our bigger regional cities as a way of accommodating some of the growth. As it's been said previously today, that the growth is good. It's actually necessary for our economy to keep thriving. But we have a view here in Australia that it needs to, and it's probably about the economics of it, but it seems to be concentrating into the metropolitan centres. And I've got some information here that I think points to a slightly different story. I'll skip through some of the slides very quickly because a lot of it's been covered. This slide is another way of looking at the difference in overseas migration and what that means in terms of natural increase. You can see there the middle line shows the contribution that overseas migration has made to our overall growth. My observation here was that if you look at that lower circle, is that overseas migration really started to overtake natural increase in around 2005, and it's dipped and peaked again a couple of times, but it's really trending upwards as a major contributor to our population. Our population sailed past 25 million earlier this year, by the way, and the ABS figures would have that doubling again by around 2050 if we continue on a current trend. In terms of interstate migration, you can see there, and again this is covered so I'll skip over it quickly, that Victoria and Queensland really took the brunt of the growth. That perhaps has something to do with better football teams, but probably also weather, job opportunities and relative affordability of housing. Now this is the really interesting slide. If you take a bit of time to just absorb what's on that chart, it shows you the growth rates that have occurred in the capital cities on the right-hand side in terms of a line graph. But if you then go and look at the figures in the chart, you can see that some of these regional cities, such as Newcastle, Sunshine Coast, Wollongong, Geelong, Toowoomba and Bendigo, have had growth rates that not only exceed but are comparable to our major capital cities, and in fact have outdone Perth, Adelaide, Canberra and Darwin in terms of their growth rates, even though they're on a smaller base. That to me suggests that there's something important going on in our regional cities. Just to jump back to Melbourne for a second, I found this chart really interesting, and it shows you just how exponential our growth has been. It took just 8 years to go from 4 million to 5 million, and if you look back down the line, you can see that it took 88 years to get to our first million and 34 years to get to the second million. So that the growth is quite remarkable, and that has something to do, I think, with the relative affordability of land. And this chart is courtesy of the Victorian Planning Authority, and it shows that the vacant land price for a house lot in the growth areas of Melbourne compared to the same area of land in Sydney is approximately half. It's also very expensive in Canberra, but that's about supply more than anything. Victoria's situation is about supply as well, and the Victorian government there has been planning extensive areas of growth area since about 2006 in a very coordinated way to deliver that land supply, and in many ways Melbourne's a victim of its own success. This plan here shows you that the extent of that planned area, and you can see there, if you take a bit of time to absorb the information there, that you'll see that there are a significant number of of precincts yet to be planned. So there's another 10 years worth of planning work there to be accommodated into those growth areas of Melbourne. And that is sheer volume. Not the same problem as Matthew. Can we reset that, please? No, it's not. Sorry about this. I'll try and move on anyway. The okay, there we go. So, in terms of long-range forecasts, and I think this is an important place to sort of pause for a moment. If you look at the three eastern seaboard capital cities and take the ABS's Series B, which is a median growth scenario, you can see there that some pretty scary numbers emerging on our capital cities. And this really, for me, starts to say, well, it's time for a bit of intervention here. We need to look at our major cities and understand what's going on there and whether or not we can actually capitalise on the investment that's been made over many decades and get more out of those places. For every 100,000 new arrivals to the city, the VPA have worked out that we require approximately 50,000 additional dwellings, 300,000 daily public transport trips, 13 new primary schools, 4 new secondary schools, 22 kindergartens, and around 240 hospital beds. So that's every year. If you look through the state budgets, there's a substantial amount of money being spent on trying to accommodate that. And again, there's been a coordinated effort to try and capture some of the value that's coming out of the land that's being rezoned through things like growth area infrastructure contributions, which I'll talk a bit more about tomorrow. But it's nowhere near enough to cover what's needed. Looking at median house prices at a more micro level, you might not be able to see the figures below the charts there, but you can see that the median house price in Sydney it's up around 1.1 million. It's cooled down a little bit from last year, but it's still substantially high, and it's then you've got Melbourne, followed by the other states. Sorry, I've just lost my place. The next few slides will drill down into this a little bit more detail and look at what's happening in some of the regional centres that I want to focus on. And I think that there are three key attributes that we need to be looking at for our regional centres, and that is relative proximity to a capital city with reliable and frequent transport options, a diverse economy which spreads the jobs across a range of industries such as construction, manufacturing, healthcare and education, lifestyle and amenity attractions such as coastal living, access to rural hinterland and a relaxed way of life. Add to this the cost of housing and some of the issues that Bronwyn was raising around time spent travelling to and from work, and you start to get a situation where the regional cities start to become viable as an alternative place to the capital city. These next few slides have been compiled by data presented by the REI and provide an aggregate median house price, and that is to take the median house price and the median apartment price and combine it. That's why it might look a little bit lower than we've seen previously. But you can see there that the northern suburbs of Brisbane, for example, are comparable with median house prices on the Sunshine Coast. it's also had better growth in terms of the value of the property. In Sydney, you can see that places like Blacktown and the outer west of Sydney are comparable with Newcastle and Wollongong. And again, it's that, I think it's got to do with the three attributes that I mentioned earlier as part of that. And in Victoria, the outer west is on par almost with Greater Geelong, and in fact Greater Geelong probably offers better value for money in terms of access to jobs and transport. Importantly, looking at the local job market there and labour force, again, I think these attributes really point to some of the key indicators of success for a regional city. The Sunshine Coast has a strong relationship with Brisbane as far as places to work is concerned, so that means that a lot of people, or a number of people, or at least a quarter of the people, are moving out of the Sunshine Coast region and heading elsewhere for work, and a substantial proportion of those arrive in Brisbane. With no train service available, it means that transport options are limited, and it's probably mostly private vehicle dominated, particularly given that a bus trip would take around 2 hours, I think. In Newcastle, again, Newcastle is slightly different to the other regional cities in that it provides a stronger, more supportive role to the Greater Hunter region. You can see there that a greater proportion of residents in Newcastle move out of the region for work, but the mapping here provided by ID Forecasting shows that less of those people move to Sydney for work, and most of them are working within the region. And just out of interest, you'll see there that there's a no fixed place of work, and I'm assuming that they're transport workers of some description. And in Melbourne, in Greater Geelong, relatively fast and frequent services to and from Melbourne have helped to make Geelong a viable location for people to live in Geelong and work in Melbourne. Geelong also has a strong local jobs base, with around 3/4 of the workforce living within the Greater Geelong area, working within the Greater Geelong area as well. Geelong also imports labour from the surrounding Surf Coast and Golden Plains regions, highlighting the regional hub role of the city. And again, this is really important in terms of being able to relieve some of the pressure that Bronwyn was talking about on our regional growth areas. There's no need for places like Melton and Werribee to be accommodating all of that growth, and with the right policy settings, which combined with infrastructure investment, land supply and good planning, places like Geelong can capitalise on previous investments in infrastructure. The labour markets are strong in the regional cities as well that I've selected. And you can see here from the next few slides that employment is high. There's been some increases, and we've seen earlier slides, so I'll skip through this again, in relation to the number of people looking for full-time work. But essentially, the workforce participation is the key figure in here. And in my view, I think that the fact that there is generally a workforce participation around the 60% mark means that there's capacity within the labour force to take on more jobs, and that's important from an industry point of view, looking to locate into these places, because from an investment point of view they can get lower yields, cheaper rent and more productivity. And if there's a labour force available, then that's all the better for it. Newcastle, again, Newcastle has had a long history of industrial steelworks and manufacturing, and that's reflected in the amount of zoned land that's available. The figures that I found this morning show that there's roughly 3,300 hectares of zoned industrial land, and that's both serviced and unserviced. Nearly 400 hectares of special use zone associated with airports and port activities, and around 500 hectares of business and enterprise zoned land. So again, that's really setting up that region to accommodate jobs and growth. Sorry to use that phrase, I forced myself into it. But it's the practicality of it, is that the planning processes need to be able to look at this stuff and say, well, that's where we want to direct people and that's where we want to direct our jobs. And again, Greater Geelong, despite the car industry moving out a few years ago, employment's remained high. Full-time workers dropped off slightly, but at least half of those who are registered as unemployed are looking for full-time work. So again, that's people wishing to be participants in the workforce, and again, it's that capacity that I was talking about earlier. The final set in this series is the diversity of employment opportunities, and again, this is really important from a regional city point of view, because if there is a shock to a particular industry, like mining, for example, in Western Australia, where the industry wound down very quickly, you get a lot of people wondering what they're going to do next, looking for work. In good regional cities where there is a diversity of employment, that's less likely to happen. And you can see there that, just watch the next few slides, because what you'll see is healthcare and social services are all very strong employers in these three key regional cities, and that's something to note. Construction is also a major contributor. So, to wrap up, sorry, I've just lost my page. A key factor in the success of regional cities as an alternative to the capital cities is the extent to which integrated transport networks can be developed. Geelong and Bendigo, for example, have full span and frequency bus services covering the city, linking to train services, suburbs, and provide that frequent connection. Geelong has 10-minute services in the peak to Melbourne, and that's a long peak too, so that's a 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. peak in the mornings, for example. Geelong also operates as a strong regional hub, as does Newcastle. While more investment and improvements can always be made, the travel times are manageable. When it comes to strategically planning to accommodate growth, relieving pressure on capital cities, there are lots of inherent efficiencies in making earlier infrastructure investments, particularly in relation to schools, community assets and roads and public transport, etc., hospital and health facilities. So if you look at the state budgets every year, you see the money that governments are spending on these regional places. They need to do that to keep them viable and keep them operating. There's additional capacity built into those facilities. We should be making more use of those. The median house price in regional cities in most cases is significantly lower, if not comparable to some of the outer urban areas of our capital cities. And as we've heard from Bronwyn, the lifestyle and amenity factor in terms of time spent in the car and time trying to access jobs is significantly greater in metro areas. The historic nature of some of those regional cities have provide a highly valued urban fabric and amenity setting, considered out of reach for most in Sydney and Melbourne. And the regional cities covered here all have good, strong labour force. So in terms of responding to the challenges of growth, I think that integrated land use and built form infrastructure planning is critical, and I think that the work that Infrastructure Australia are doing is critical to that. I think that I would like to see a bit more focus on the regional cities in terms of that, as well as in order to provide that integrated, because the focus on just the capital cities tends to create more of the same problem that we have. A strategic approach to balanced distribution of population growth coordinated approach to regional cities in terms of unlocking potential value. In terms of infrastructure investment, the introduction of value capture mechanisms like the growth area infrastructure charge to our regional cities, the implementation of developer contributions to ensure that the timely delivery of roads, intersections and community facilities can occur. And just out of interest, Victoria has just spent the last year and a half rejigging its infrastructure contribution system to ensure that public land the public land contribution is provided faster and more upfront by way of taking out the economic value and making it more of a straight land transfer, which is a pretty important innovation. It's important to sweat existing assets. Let's get more out of what we've already previously paid for as taxpayers. There needs to be more of a focus on the requirements for the strategic planning processes to deliver infrastructure and in the process leveraging major projects. And by that I mean getting more private investment into major projects. To conclude, I just want to sum up with some benefits for this type of approach to planning for the bus operators, particularly in the regions. In most cases, bus networks in our regional cities are a primary public transport in terms of inter-suburb movement and connections to outside the region. With a greater focus on coordinating and planning for our regional cities, it places an emphasis on creating higher span and frequency services. And as we know, that's really the only way you increase patronage. It also provides the ability to support intermodal connections, intercity rail, and provide stronger patronage for inter-regional bus services such as Horsham to Bendigo or Nowra to Wollongong. And that concludes me. Thanks.